Hello and welcome to This is the Way. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald.
Hey, Justin. So, one of the things that I've been thinking about is that, well, today we have all this new technology. I guess not even that new anymore. I mean, really good word processors, really good
Mm,
resources for information that we can quickly access over the internet. We can access papers and books, and we can
mm.
do all of this so much more easily and much more quickly than certainly, let's say, back in the 1990s. And certainly, let's say, like in 1930s. I mean, who was writing back then? Who were the philosophers? It must have
Yeah.
been extraordinarily hard. I mean, yeah, you had to get like hard copies of things and so on. But now I can go to Phil Papers, which is a great website. And I can, if I'm interested in thinking more about, let's say, free will, I just type in free will and there pops up so many articles, or maybe even mentions on the sprouts like, oh, have people been working on that? What are some of the most
Yeah.
recent papers on that? It comes right up real fast. So there's
Yeah.
all this information. Word processor is pretty good. AI technology is improving, as we've talked about before. So I guess there are really two questions I have. One is, first of all, is it a lot easier and faster to write papers, or is it harder because there's so much out there? Secondly, what about the quality? Like, if we
Uh,
were to compare the papers being written today, and I guess here we're just talking about mainly philosophy papers because that's the world we're in. Yeah, so if we date back 50s, I mean, who are the famous philosophers like J.L. Austin, like Mackie, Anscombe, when Philippa Foot, I guess, was writing?
yeah.
So like, although those they were writing some good stuff back then, I guess
Yeah.
there's just also so many more papers being published and books being published today. But yeah, is the quality, is it higher now
Is it
because
being
it's,
sacrificed because the
yeah,
bar is being lowered or something? It's
or
easier
is it
to,
even higher because people can,
yes, there are
look
more
at
people participating. Yeah.
good stuff? So yeah, more people participating also, globally also.
Yeah.
So yeah, what do you think about that? I don't know if I have any real answers, but I was thinking about this and talking to a friend about this the other day. So I'd like to hear your thought.
It's a good question. I'm just getting used to this idea that I'm becoming one of those people who says back in my day, because it was still the case in high school that when I had to write a big research paper, I would take lots and lots of notes by hand, kind of have a pretty good idea of what I wanted to say and how it all would hang together as a coherent piece, and then go write it on a typewriter. As it happens, by the time I went to college, back then you usually didn't have certainly not a laptop. You didn't have a computer in your room, but you would go to a computer lab and stay up usually all night. I remember
Hmm.
going to the computer lab after dinner and then just invariably finishing around 3 or 4 a.m. or something. I've experienced something of this transition, and here's what I can say. This is just very, tentative, but it seems to me that back when I wrote papers the old-fashioned way, they were in some ways better and worse. And in one dimension, in one respect, they were better and worse. And that has to do with being a coherent whole. So what I mean is that in my mind, I wouldn't even begin writing until I felt like I had a relatively clear original thought to argue. And then I had this like outline that I had written out by hand with lots of arguments and such, and it all fit together as one coherent whole. So I myself, for my own purposes, in terms subjectively speaking, the papers were a more coherent whole than they are now. Now you can just sit down and just start typing away, and you can have a kind of assortment of random thoughts or what have you. So in that sense, they were better. They were more coherent in my mind. But actually, objectively speaking, as someone who's read papers from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, 50s, you mentioned Anscombe and so on, oftentimes because they didn't have the luxury of having a word processor where they could go back and easily erase, you can tell that in fact the papers or the books are a little bit disjointed. Like they started out with one vision for the paper or the book, and then about halfway through they realize, oh my God, I have this eureka moment, and they kind of revise the vision. But it's too late if you've typed it all out by hand
Hmm.
to go
Wow.
back and
Yeah.
rewrite it all. So
Yeah.
it seems more like you're following the evolving train of thought of the author when you read the older stuff. And so maybe in that respect, it's not quite as coherent. It
Hmm.
doesn't form a well integrated whole. But I
Hmm.
still think that just in terms of my own subjective experience, nowadays I can write a paper and maybe decide a year later that I don't like the last section and go back and rewrite the last section, really without
Mhm.
any sense of like how it
Mhm.
fits into sections 1, 2, and 3. So subjectively speaking, I'm not required to have a big picture view in my head in order to write a paper that counts as a complete paper. Whereas back then I
Mhm.
really felt like I was. There's a
Mhm.
parallel, there's an analogy in lectures, like it used to be everyone took lecture notes by hand and you didn't have this, fallback option. You could record the lecture and go back and watch it later, or, easily share digital notes, someone's typed notes from the lecture. The goal of a good lecturer back then was to really have everyone on the same page. If you were a good lecturer, you would like make sure that your listeners knew what the major points were, when you'd move from one point to the next, and so on. And that's no longer a priority because it's not assumed that we have to share the same mental space at all moments. You can always fall back on just audio recordings or what have you. So I guess I'm
Mhm.
just saying a convoluted answer, Richard. There were all these incentives to make sure that we could retain good big picture visions of our research projects, both the stuff that we read and the stuff that we were going to write back then, simply
Mhm.
because we relied on memory and kind of raw mental power more than just digits or visual text or what have you.
Yeah. I mean, what about the aspect that there are so many more papers out now
Yeah,
and they're accessible? So I do wonder if there is more of a burden today to kind of, are the reference lists longer now? I wonder,
yeah, right.
probably they are. Whereas I wonder if philosophers, someone like Iris Murdoch, when she was working on, her ideas and philosophical, like in Sovereignty of the Good, and I'm sure she was reading other things, but I wonder if they were able to spend a bit more time on their own work, or I don't know, because I guess, well, in a way, maybe this is a little bit autobiographical. I've kind of struggled between like reading other books or papers and then like working on my own papers, and maybe that's just an unending struggle, but there's so much stuff out there, and
Yeah,
also even in other disciplines, if you have a little bit more of a interdisciplinary kind of mode, and I do to some extent, there's papers in psychology and interesting stuff going on in other disciplines like sociology and so on. So do we have to pay attention to all of that? And so
yeah,
I'm not entirely sure if there's a real answer to this, but the flood of information, just the amount of information is just enormous too. It
yeah.
does make it kind of exciting too, but maybe also a bit more challenging in other ways.
Right. So if you have a personal or professional ethic that says you can't write on topic X or Y unless you've read all of the sort of relevant literature on topic X or Y that passes some bar of like peer review or something, published in a respectable journal or something.
Hmm.
So if that's your personal view, like I can't write about Mengzi and the sprouts of virtue until I've read all the stuff that's respectable on Mengzi and the sprouts of virtue, then yes, it's become much more burdensome and you can easily get bogged down in just reading what other people have to say about the topic and never get around to finding your own voice or articulating your own view. Right. There are more venues for publishing now, so maybe
Hmm.
it's not quite inevitable because it could be that the quality of the input, the material that's being submitted, is so high that even though we have more venues, it's still overall better or something. Yeah, it's really hard to generalize. I mean, I guess the one thing I can say safely without, I think, without having to make a big speculative assumption is that it used to be that you have to work a lot harder now. So basically, in the Western world, at least, you don't publish unless you have something original to say. The assumption is always that there's this field out there and there's a kind of status quo for the field. There are things that people in the field know or regard as plausible, and you're supposed to contribute something to that. Either you're supposed to destabilize what's considered to be well known or plausible, or you're supposed to add something new that they
Hmm.
didn't know before and now they do know. And given that that's always the presupposition, that's like one implicit criterion in all scholarship that you're going to contribute something new. Yeah, the burden is much higher because there's a lot of stuff already out there,
Hmm.
and so it's more work in that sense. Yeah, I don't know. I'm torn. I mean, there's also more
Hmm.
people writing Chinese philosophies. From my point of view, there are more people writing Chinese philosophy than ever before. And
Yeah.
not just in English, but in Chinese and Japanese and Korean and presumably French and German too. And
Hmm.
not that I can read Japanese or Korean, French or German, but anyway, so it's generally the case that maybe back in the 60s, if you had an idea for a paper topic and it seemed like a kind of surprising topic, you would look high and low and not find anything published on that topic. But now it's often the case, at least for me, that I'm pleasantly surprised to discover that there's often a kind of short article in Chinese on the very issue. When
Hmm.
Steve Engel and I, who wrote this book on Neo-Confucianism, were working on a book on the Neo-Confucians, we often found that this was true for technical terms. Like whatever the term was, we thought, well, it's actually not entirely clear to us from just reading the best known passages what these terms mean. I bet there are some papers out there that basically take all of the major passages where this term
Hmm.
is used and then try to synthesize it. And sure enough, there were like
Hmm.
these university academic journals that would kind of pull it all together. So that was really handy in some ways. Yeah. So yeah, I
Hmm.
guess I'm just torn. It's characteristic of all academics if you ask them about their field these days. If they're at all older and at all jaded, they'll say, "Oh, there's so much schlock. There's so much, kind of junk, and it's too easy to publish now."
Hmm.
But one worries that the same cognitive biases that make all old people think that things were glorious back in their youth are also influencing scholars to say roughly the same thing. But so I
Yeah.
guess the only thing I feel comfortable saying is that it's more work to the point where you have something new to say and publish it.
Mm.
And yet it's much less work to write it, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, so much. I mean, word processor is really cool. You don't have to you could delete pretty easily, I've never worked on a typewriter in my life actually, so I'm not sure
Wow.
what
Huh.
that's like. But thinking about it, it does sound cumbersome. Although some people say they like it. So I actually know some people who
Yeah.
actually do write on a typewriter or notepad. They like to write stuff by hand.
Yes. Hmm.
So that's and really interesting. And then I think eventually, or they put it on a word processor gradually. Okay, good. Yeah, there's a lot more, of course, we could talk about. But maybe we should go on to today's topic here, since we also have a guest today. And
Yes.
so today we're going to discuss this really famous, beloved passage to all scholars of Chinese philosophy in the Zhuangzi. And it's about a butcher, sometimes named Cook Ding. So sometimes people refer to this figure as the butcher or sometimes Cook Ding. And this butcher occupies one of the lowest social positions in ancient China, which is butchering. And what's remarkable is that he's depicted as having this deep understanding of the Tao or the way. And even this powerful king who watches him comes to really respect him and admire him in some sense for his knowledge of the way. And this passage is often understood as capturing the core features of the Zhuangzian vision of the way and the good life. So we thought we would really dive deep into this specific passage. We'll read it in whole and talk about it. And fortunately, we have this great guest, Karyn Lai, who's written many papers and even has books discussing this passage. So we're really fortunate to have her. So, Justin, can you say a little bit more about this passage, how we're going to explore it, and maybe some other themes of the passage as well?
Yeah. So in a certain kind of Taoist literature, it's not true of the Tao Te Ching, that other Taoist text that we've sometimes referred to, the kind of better known one. But it's true of the Zhuangzi. It's true of a lesser known Taoist text known as the Liezi. There's a tendency to write about, we might say, some of the most famous passages, some of the most famous moments in this Taoist literature are sometimes called skill stories. So they're stories of ordinary people, usually people from lower classes, performing skillful activities at an extremely high level and explaining how they learn to do it, how they do it, what the secret to their success is, maybe is one way of understanding them. And these stories have just been an object of great fascination. So much psychological literature written in the 20th century about flow-like experiences takes its cues from these skill stories. And then those in general who grew up in East Asian contexts with Taoist sources as sort of inspiration for children's stories and what have you are often familiar with these stories as well. So anyone who's sort of had a East Asian style education, in which Taoism played a part, will know the story of Cook Ding or the story of the butcher. Yeah, so it's a story of this butcher who's praised by the feudal lord that employs him, and very highly, and then he goes on to explain how he does his job, and the feudal lord ends up concluding that he's learned something really important about caring for life from this butcher. We were very fortunate to have Karyn Lai, Professor Karyn Lai, who is a scholar who writes a great deal about skill like knowledge, mastery, and Taoism. And she's edited some important volumes on that very topic. And she agreed to join us just to discuss this famous passage. We've often thought that, one of the things we should be doing early in this podcast series is introducing our readers to the touchstone passages. And this is surely one of the touchstones. And we were very glad that one of the scholars who's thought most about it was able to join us to discuss it. We'll discuss some themes such as forms of knowledge or forms of knowledge ascription and the implications of this skill-like knowledge or insights about skill-like knowledge for how you should live your life. Maybe even a little bit about the significance of skill and sort of what were perceived in ancient China as lower class crafts and ways of living, livelihoods, for insight into the way. Those are all topics that we'll touch upon in the discussion that will follow shortly after this break.
All right. So we are extremely fortunate, happy, and delighted to have Professor Karyn Lai here with us today as our expert guest on the classical Chinese text, the Zhuangzi, to discuss it with us, this passage. And Professor Lai is the editor of the Chinese comparative philosophy section of the Philosophy Compass Journal, which I have contributed, and I benefited enormously from her excellent comments many years ago. She's also the co-editor of the Chinese philosophy section of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is one of the most important journals, which if you're a philosopher, you really are very, very grateful for anyone doing the good work. And also, she's also the associate editor of the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, which is a terrific, excellent contemporary journal. I've been rejected from that journal many times, and I hold no grudges, and I will keep sending my stuff there. And
necessary growth experience.
Yes, we all know the pains. And I should note that Professor Lai is also a professor of philosophy at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And currently, she's also helping to co-host the section on classical Chinese philosophy for Peter Adamson's excellent podcast on the history of philosophy without any gaps.
Yes.
And so that is exciting. I think maybe we'll ask Karyn a little bit about that at some point. And we're very excited that that's coming out. And so welcome. Hi, Karyn. How are you doing?
I'm well, Richard, and thank you and Justin for having me here. It's such an honor. It's such a great podcast series you're running. So very happy to be here and excited to talk about the Zhuangzi.
The honor is all ours. Thank you, Karyn.
Thank you.
Richard and I like this format where we focus on a particular passage that's memorable or influential, and we're going to focus on the Cook Ding passage, sometimes known as the Butcher passage. We're going to be reading from Paul Schelberg's translation. He translates the key term as butcher, so we'll refer to him, at least when I'm reading the translation, we'll refer to them as the butcher. Yeah, as usual, I'm overdoing it, but I'm inclined to put on my intro to Chinese philosophy teacher persona and break this long passage down into some sections. So I'm going to say there are 4 sections. Just to give listeners a sort of preview of how it goes, basically what happens is it's an interaction between the butcher and a ruler, a kind of feudal lord, Lord Wenhui. It's often assumed that the butcher is performing a kind of ceremonial butchery, so he's cutting up an ox, seemingly for an important ceremonious occasion. So it's perhaps an important religious ritual, or perhaps it's just a big banquet or something. And he does it with so much musicality, with so much, almost like a dance, and that this feudal lord is really impressed, and he praises him. And he says, "Oh, excellent, that technique can reach such heights as this." And that's basically what I'm going to call the first section of the passage. I'm calling it the Butcher Dances section. It's basically about a description of the butcher's dance. or dance-like performance of butchery and the feudal lord's praise of that dance. Then the second section is probably the most famous one from this passage, and that's the butcher's description of his own sort of skillful performance. I want to say the butcher's description of his technique, but he actually says it goes beyond technique. So that's a really important qualification or sort of self-description that we might have a chance to sort of elaborate on. And that's section 2, his description of his technique or his thing that transcends or goes beyond technique. And then section 3 is a somewhat neglected part of the passage where he describes how he handles difficult parts or hard parts in his work. So occasionally he gets to places in his butchery where it's just very difficult. It's like maybe there's a knot of muscles or tendons or the bones are close together. So how does he handle that? And that's section 3 where he describes how he handles difficult parts. And then finally, section 4 is the sort of takeaway or the conclusion, which comes from the feudal lord. He says that he's heard the words of a butcher and learned how to care for life. So it's kind of a quick takeaway or conclusion. So those are the 4 sections, and I'm going to start with the first one, the butcher's dance. And yeah, here it is. This is the Paul Schelberg translation. A butcher was cutting up an ox for Lord Wenhui. Wherever his hand touched, wherever his shoulder leaned, wherever his foot stepped, wherever his knee pushed, with a zip, with a whoosh, he handled his chopper with aplomb and never skipped a beat. He moved in time to the dance of the mulberry forest, presumably an ancient, a well-known dance, and harmonized with the head of the line symphony. Lord Wenhui said, "Ah, excellent that technique can reach such heights." And that's section 1. Section 2 is the butcher's response to Lord Wenhui's praise about his technique. So the butcher sheathed his chopper and responded, "What your servant values is the way, which goes beyond technique. When I first began cutting up oxen, I did not see anything but oxen. 3 years later, I couldn't see the whole ox, and now I encounter them with spirit and don't look with my eyes. Sensible knowledge stops, and spiritual desires proceed. I rely on the heavenly patterns, striking the big gaps, and guided by the large fissures, and follow what is inherently so. I never touch a ligament or tendon, much less do any heavy wrenching. A good butcher changes his chopper every year because he chips it. An average butcher changes it every month because he breaks it. There are spaces between those joints, and the edge of the blade has no thickness. If you use what has no thickness to go where there is space, oh, there is plenty of room to play about in. That's why after 19 years, the blade of my chopper is still as though fresh from the grindstone." And that's the end of section 2, his description of his technique that goes beyond technique. Section 3, how the butcher handles difficult parts. So he adds now, "Still, when I get to a hard place, I see the difficulty and take breathless care. My gaze settles. My movements slow. I move the chopper slightly, and in a twinkling, it's come apart, crumbling to the ground like a clod of earth. I stand holding my chopper and glance all around, dwelling on my accomplishment. Then I clean my chopper and put it away." That's the end of section 3 on handling difficult parts. And then finally, there's the conclusion or the takeaway. That's section 4. Lord Wenhui said, "Excellent. I have heard the words of a butcher and learned how to care for life." And that's it. That's the passage. So many of our listeners know this, but not everyone will. This passage belongs, it's almost like a sort of subgenre in Daoist in literature. You see these skill stories in another famous Daoist text known as the Liezi, and you see them in the Zhuangzi. This is the most famous skill story in the Zhuangzi. It's the one that we're focusing on first. And it's often taken to be emblematic of, or representative of other skill stories, maybe of non-action or wu wei in the Zhuangzi. So that's why we're excited to discuss it with Professor Lai. Karyn has, in addition to all the other accomplishments that we mentioned earlier, she's really done some excellent stuff on skill-like knowledge, or what's sometimes called knowledge, knowing how, in the Zhuangzi. So she's just the right person to discuss this particular passage with. Having read the whole thing, at the risk of being somewhat repetitive, I want to insist on rereading each section before we discuss it. So we decided that we would discuss each section one by one. Yeah, I'm going to go back and reread that first section again, just to remind the listeners, especially those who've never heard this one or never read this passage before, of what's there. So this is the section that I'm calling The Butcher Dances, and here it is again. A butcher was cutting up an ox for Lord Wenhui. Wherever his hand touched, wherever his shoulder leaned, wherever his foot stepped, wherever his knee pushed, with a zip, with a whoosh, he handled his chopper with aplomb and never skipped a beat. He moved in time to the dance of the mulberry forest and harmonized with the head of the line symphony. Lord Wenhui said, "Ah, excellent that technique can reach such heights." And I guess maybe I should add that the Chinese character for the word technique is ji. So for Chinese readers, that's ji shu de ji. That's, technique is not a bad translation. Sometimes it's translated as skill. Both of those are perfectly defensible translations of this character.
Yeah, what an excellent passage. And there's so many interesting things here. First of all, we got this butcher, which is a very gross activity, actually. And I've never served as a butcher, but especially even more gruesome back in those days.
It's taking something that is basically regarded as a pretty low-class activity. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's sort of an artisan class activity, maybe even worse, because after all, it doesn't require a great deal of high literacy or education. So it's not the sort of high status position that historically in classical China and basically ever after aspired to. And one imagines that because it was so gross, because it was just so smelly and bloody and gross, that it wasn't seen as a desirable job. And yet, one of the interesting things about the Zhuangzi is it often glorifies people who have these jobs and do them in this way that seems in some ways to be almost artistic or musical or transcend ordinary abilities.
And in this passage too, which we'll get to at the end, couldn't ever imagine an official learning something from a cook.
Yes, right.
That's just crazy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that's shocking too, right? That the ruler said, I heard the words of a butcher, but I actually learned something about something important to him, which he calls caring for life. Yeah.
Right. This is Lord Wenhui, a king, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone of pretty high status. So that's really very interesting and very cool. Yeah, I know, Justin, you get, longtime listeners or people who have listened to us. I think the way Justin put it once was, a day is not complete for me until I make an Aristotle reference.
Yeah, right.
In this case, although, I do love Aristotle and virtue ethics generally. But what's interesting about this is, Aristotle, I mean, one kind of criticism of his ethics is that sometimes it's very aristocratic, it's kind of high class of nobility. Right. And here, I mean, you're going low class as possible, especially in ancient China. But to be honest with you, not even just ancient China. I remember my dad telling me something like this, like not to become a butcher. So my dad is from South Korea. Yeah, I mean, even in contemporary South Korean society, being a butcher is not considered like an occupation with high reputation. I guess even to this day, at least in parts of East Asia, that reputation still holds. And I'm pretty sure in ancient China, it was considered a very lowly kind of work.
Yeah.
And so continuing on this theme, it's really interesting that this butcher is part of seemingly a ritual, as Justin noted earlier. He must be involved in some kind of ritual of butchering, or maybe not. It's hard to tell. We know ritual is part of the high life.
Yeah.
Ordinary people might have their little rituals, but the important ones, such as this one, the dance of the mulberry forest, that's an important ritual. You don't get ordinary mortals engaging in it.
Yeah.
And with rituals, you would expect in ancient China, there's a high degree of reverence and there are key players. You don't expect a butcher to be a player in a significant ritual. But here he is, and he's doing the gory. It seems to me it's presenting the image of a ritual that's normally so high, but putting in a very kind of basic, low-class human activity.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought about that connection to ritual because these are, yeah, parts of kind of well-known rituals of the time. There's some like footnotes I have, like this dance of the mulberry forest is a celebration of Tang's victory over Jie and the founding of the Shang dynasty. That's the
Yeah.
historical note. And the head of the line symphony is part of a larger corpus known as the Whole Pond music commemorating the reign of Yao.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this wow, this great history here, which
Yeah.
yeah.
What happens when you read traditional commentaries like that is it's almost like the traditional commentator's first task is to make sure that for any references to established texts or pieces or persons, you know who they are and what their kind of historical provenance is, where they come from, and who authored them, and that kind of thing. And sometimes it has some comical results because I don't know about you too, but I sometimes think that Zhuangzi is just making up names. And so I'm not always sure that there actually is a historical source to be cited. But I mean, I think that sometimes in the Zhuangzi, the authors are parodying or lampooning the way kind of high society types write their prose at the time, where it's just
Yeah.
rich in references to historical texts and that kind of thing. Anyway, so yeah, it's quite possible that I just don't know enough about the context and about ancient dance and music. It's quite possible that those footnotes you found, Richard, are correct.
That juxtaposition is so amazing, though, of butchering this gory, as Karyn put it, this gory
Yeah,
activity,
yeah,
and this kind of beautiful and moving music that's being accompanied or like
yeah,
somehow connected. Juxtaposition is just really cool. And he's like
Right.
harmonizing, and it's almost like he's dancing, but he is
yeah,
cutting up an ox. It's a very bloody and messy activity.
Yeah.
yeah.
And even if we took the line of understanding this little bit here, just plainly without assuming that the butcher was engaging in a ritual, we just read it plainly. The butcher was cutting up an ox. That's it. You also want to ask questions.
Mm-hmm,
What is the Lord doing there watching him?
mm-hmm,
And at least I think this idea of ritual has to come back in again, irrespective of whether we don't need to think that the butcher is engaging in ritual. What we can focus on, however, is that Lord Wenhui no doubt would have his rituals.
mm-hmm.
And this is Kukding's ritual, in scare quotes. This is his low class ritual, so to speak.
Mm.
And the passage is almost showing up these high class rituals. Look at Kukding, the way he does it. He could bring such a lowly activity to great heights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In some ways, ritualizing something that may not have been seen as a ritual in the eyes of Lord Wenhui
Right.
before this. Yeah.
Right. Even greater than Lord Wenhui, who is participating in a ritual that's been set up way before him and he's just following the rules.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, well, I want to leave plenty of time for section 2. This is a really famous section and so interesting and rich. So this is the one where the butcher describes his method or his technique, which goes beyond technique. So I'll read it again. The butcher sheathed his chopper and responded, "What your servant values is the way, which goes beyond technique." I think the Chinese is 近乎技, so it's something like, yeah, it takes a step, it progresses beyond technique. When I first began cutting up oxen, I did not see anything but oxen. 3 years later, I couldn't see the whole ox. And now I encounter them with spirit and don't look with my eyes. For me, it's a very memorable line. I encounter them with spirit and don't look with my eyes. Sensible knowledge stops and spiritual desires proceed. I rely on the heavenly patterns, sometimes translated as natural patterns. Striking the big gaps, I'm guided by the large fissures and follow what is inherently so or what's naturally so. I never touch a ligament or tendon, much less do any heavy wrenching. A good butcher changes his chopper every year because he chips it. An average butcher changes it every month because he breaks it. There are spaces between those joints and the edge of the blade has no thickness. If you use what has no thickness to go where there is space, there's plenty of extra room to play about in. That's why after 19 years, the blade of my chopper is still as though fresh from the grindstone. Here's my question. Maybe neither of you care about as much as I do, but when he says that what he values is the way, which goes beyond technique, I've noticed that among sort of contemporary scholars in the 20th and 21st centuries who write on it, they tend to interpret that line in either of two ways, usually not in a way that combines both. So one way is to understand it as suggesting that the way completely transcends technique, that like technique doesn't even lie. Technique is the wrong word here. So what the butcher seems to be doing, I don't know, is making himself a conduit for this cosmic force, the way, which such that he doesn't have to rely on technique anymore. Technique is what? Like, thinking about procedures and processes and rules or what have you. And he doesn't do that. So he's transcending technique. We'll call that the transcendence reading. The other reading is that it's really just like some steps beyond technique that folds technique into it. So it's like he still has mastery of the technique. It's just that it's somehow even better than or beyond what would normally be expected of someone who's mastered the technique. You see the difference? So on the transcends technique reading, it's really like he just leaves technique behind. It's the ladder that he kicks away or something. Whereas in the second reading, I think it's suggesting that he's still relying on technique. It's still a constituent of or an ingredient of his process in some way, but it's that he's doing something over and above relying on technique as well. Maybe it doesn't matter much, but it kind of matters to me because the second reading strikes me as more plausible. I think if you spend all your life, if someone is that good at butchery, they're going to have to be relying on all these aptitudes, skills, sort of habits of thought and muscle memory and what have you, that they could only have learned in the process of mastering technique. So I don't think that technique is kicked away. But I mention it because one of the traditional commentators that I'm sort of obsessed with, Guoxiang, he seems to sort of prefer the first reading. It's hard to tell for sure because the comments are so clipped, they're so short, but it seems like he wants to say that Cookding or the butcher is basically rejecting uses of technique, which after all is a kind of acquired skill. And he reads Zhuangzi as a sort of back to nature, sort of Daoist thinker. But that just doesn't seem plausible to me. Well, I think what he's suggesting is that it's technique plus, it's technique plus something else, sort of being attuned to the cosmic way. It's hard to fill in that plus, but there's so I guess I'm more tempted by the second reading.
So the first reading, Justin, that Guoxiang favors something like the skill of butchery, or maybe any skill or technique, has purely instrumental value. And in fact, it's not really the real goal or end. The real goal or end is the way or the Tao. And that's really what's important and significant and valuable.
Yes.
And in fact, it's maybe just a kind of a necessary stepping stone, but it's really not something you should really intrinsically or inherently value at all, this specific skill of butchering. Yeah. Whereas I guess the second reading suggests that it's almost like butchering, for at least for this cook, this butcher, it's almost part of his mode of living or his very specific, substantial way of achieving the way. And it's not like a mere stepping stone. It's like sort of the way that it's necessary in some sense. And it's his like really important pathway to realizing the way. So it's not just of pure instrumental value. It's almost like it's a constitutive part of living this way of the Tao, or something like that.
Yeah, okay. Exactly. I mean, that's a good kind of rough and ready general description of the thing I have in mind. And it's not any more precise than that. So you've really captured it well. Like, I mean, one way of spelling it out more precisely, but maybe this goes too far, is to say the question is whether technique is still active. So like all these things that he's learned that I want to call kind of mastering the technique in the process of becoming a very good butcher, presumably like judging where to cut and how to turn with the wrist and, when to speed up and slow down, that kind of thing. And the question is that knowledge still active in this special case where he's performing butchery at this extremely high, almost musical level? Is it still active or not? And one way of reading this traditional commentator, Guoxiang, he's kind of the most influential of the commentators, is to say, no, he's now given up on technique completely, and he's returned to sort of natural cosmic forces that we associate with the way, understood as a cosmic entity or source. And he's kind of unlearned all of his techniques are no longer needed. But actually, for me, as someone who spends a lot of time looking at classical Chinese texts, that's not the most natural reading of the classical Chinese. The Chinese suggest to me that it's like there's a kind of progression and that he's progressed beyond technique, but that doesn't necessarily imply that he's given up on it completely or he's transcended it, you know?
It's just fascinating listening to both of you present, I think, what are only very slightly different readings of the way that Zhuangzi talks about technique and way. And I think there is a nuance there that could bring together what you've both said, plus make sense of what Guoxiang is saying. And Justin, when you talk about technique and way, you're talking about them as sort of activities in an activity-focused way. So
that's true.
How do we do this? With technique. How do we do this in alignment with the Tao? And Richard was focusing on something slightly different about what emanates from the individual. So you're both talking, one was activity focused and one is more the agent, if we can say, the person who's carrying out the activity. And what strikes me as really, really interesting that would help make sense of what Guoxiang is saying is perhaps that it's not so much that technique has to be completely given up, but rather the question, when you're trying to carve an ox, what are you aiming for? So the question is the ultimate aim. If someone says, I'm aiming for technique, and then Guoxiang says, no, you shouldn't be aiming for technique. So that could explain why he puts it aside, right? One should aim for Tao, the way.
Yeah.
And the Tao then could incorporate the technicalities, the skills, so to speak, without putting aside. The question is, what's your goal? What are you trying to do here?
Like a father who's a plumber, he's fixing the pipes, but someone goes, why are you fixing the pipes? Well, one answer is, I need to fix this broken pipe. I'm a plumber. The other is, I'm feeding my family. Or I'm like, there's like a further ultimate goal. I'm like, yeah, I have kids. I have a family who depend on me. I'm making a living. I'm trying to, it's interesting because there's different like levels of answers you might give.
Yeah.
And I guess your thought there, Karyn, is the ultimate goal, but still is like, there's a further final end to, it's not merely just this like putting the blade right in this spot. That's
right.
Not.
That's right. And that takes us back to the last sentence in section 1, where Lord Wenhui said, excellent that technique can reach such heights.
Right.
What the butcher is then saying here is, you got the wrong end of the stick.
Right.
Yeah. That's not what we should be looking at.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense of that part.
Asking the wrong question.
Yeah, so that's consistent with my understanding of oftentimes in the Zhuangzi and in Daoist texts in general, when it says the thing I'm aiming for is not X, not fill in the blank. What they often mean is that like first personally, internally, from my point of view as an agent, I'm not thinking about that thing, you know? So famously, the Zhuangzi has these references to forgetting, you know, to fasting the mind so that you forget stuff. There's another famous skill story about woodcarver Qing, and he fasts the mind, and he reaches the point eventually that he's forgotten the ruler and his court, and he's, you know, forgotten other people. That doesn't mean that, like, he says they no longer exist for me, is what he says, right? He's not suggesting that they suddenly stop existing. He's not making that kind of radical subjective idealist sort of statement about existence. He's just saying that, like, I'm not concerned with them, not thinking about my employer, about other people and what their opinions of my work are. And so similarly here, yeah, he's saying it goes beyond technique in the sense that I'm not thinking about technique. That's my sort of, I hope, relatively friendly gloss or interpretation of what Karyn just said. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is repeated again in another skill story, and that's the cicada catcher story.
Yes.
And later in the text, and then there Confucius is a figure. He's walking in the forest and he's quite amazed by this cicada catcher who is catching cicada with a pole with sticky adhesive at the end and catches them as if he was just picking them up with his hands. And Confucius is quite stunned by the skill involved. And he says, do you have skill? And the cicada catcher does not answer the question whether he's skilled. He just goes, I have Dao.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Which is so amazing.
Yeah.
Again, it's to Confucius, the cicada catcher saying, you're asking the wrong question, friend.
Yes, right. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. That's analogous in that respect. It's important to establish that it's not something like technique or skill that's being aimed at in the cicada catching story. I think there the word for skill is chow, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a slightly different word, but yeah, it's almost a formula. You get the impression that this is something that early authors of Taoist literature did, that someone who doesn't know better suggests, this is a great skill or great technique that you're displaying for us. And then the master of that skill or technique says, no, it's not technique or skill.
Yeah, there's this quote by this samurai warrior, Miyamoto Musashi. If you know the way broadly, you will see it in everything. This idea that if you have the way, then like you'll see it exemplified maybe in every specific thing you do. Yeah, so I was kind of reminded of that quote.
Yeah, it's
but
great.
That's great. I guess we should keep going with
We
this
should keep
section.
going. I don't know if either of you want to weigh in on this issue about not looking with his eyes. I don't know how literally we're supposed to interpret that. So I'll read the line again. After a great deal of practice and experience, he says, and now I encountered them, meaning the oxen, the carcasses of the oxen, with spirit and don't look with my eyes. Sensible knowledge stops and spiritual desires proceed. That sounds maybe magical or almost mystical or something. I don't know. I just wonder if you have any interpretations of that.
I think when one sees the word spirit, and particularly with Schauberg's translation as well later on, spiritual desires, one almost immediately thinks about the religious.
Yeah.
And it's so tricky because you don't find in Zhuangzi any clear indications about what the term spirit translation of Shen. And there were so many different uses of spirit right across the text of this time. I think you could think of spirit here, at least in this passage, in terms of perhaps something that's a capacity that humans don't typically have. I think that's to put it very broadly, perhaps quite blandly.
No.
Yeah, the spirit is not a capacity that humans typically have, and that's clear. So we have contemporaneous texts, for instance, the Mengzi will say we're born with the human heart mind. There are various capacities. They talk about seeing, they talk about hearing. But of course, this Shen is not part of what humans typically are. So it's something extra human. And he has to not look with what is given to human, what the typical human capacities are.
Yeah, I think that's right. Oftentimes when shun, which is being translated here as spirit, is used as a modifier in classical Chinese texts, I'm thinking of like the phrase shunming, spiritual understanding, spiritual clarity. Yeah, it's often meant to imply that it's beyond normal human capacities. It's like there's kind of an implicit hierarchy of entities, and spirits are, a step above human beings. Yeah, so that's the safest way to translate it.
And I think this links with what the butcher says next. I rely on heavenly patterns, strike in the big gaps, am guided by the large fissures, and follow what is inherently so. I think the way we can understand spirit without even necessarily reading any inkling of spirituality or religion into what's going on in this passage is that when you think about the human capacities, how do we express them? Typically, how we express the human capacities, we do so in a way that's trained. We're trained to speak a language. We're trained to hear different sounds. We're trained to talk in particular ways. So all these forms that we're trained to do. And of course, Shen being an extra human capacity is not something you can train a person in. And I think the focus is not so much on what Shen is, but I think what Schauberg has translated as the heavenly patterns. to me, when the Zhuangzi speaks about the heavenly patterns, often it means just what's there out there in the world, that it's just the world as it is given to us. The ox is given to us. Where the joints are, that's given to us. It's not the butcher's making, and the butcher just has to follow. There are bigger gaps, there are smaller gaps, and so he follows what is given. And this is very interesting because I think it has implications for later on, as we will see, the takeaway from this passage about life, that there are certain givens in life. You take them. If you want to deny them, it comes at a cost. If you want to negate them, that comes as a cost, but you look at them. And sometimes seeing with the eyes, going back to that metaphor, is seeing what we're taught to see. And sometimes when we see only what we're taught to see, you fail to see the world as it actually is.
Yes, right. Yeah, that's really interesting. And the phrase heavenly patterns translates tianli. So tian is often translated as heaven or nature with a capital N. And li is translated pretty safely as patterns. It's kind of an abstract term. It's a little difficult. Sometimes it's translated as principle. That's right. So there's a temptation to read heavenly patterns and this reference to heavenly patterns, following on and relying on them, as a kind of religious or supernatural reference, as a reference to something religious or supernatural. And I have to say, among scholars who work on Zhuangzi, there are many religious studies scholars and philosophers who are deeply invested in that kind of more religious reading. And I want to take it seriously because I don't mean to dismiss it. I think that philosophers like me have this kind of wistful inclination to read the Zhuangzi as completely compatible with contemporary scientific naturalism or something. Anyway, that's one possibility. But it's worth mentioning, underscoring something Karyn said just a little bit ago, which is that sometimes heaven in classical Chinese, Tian, just refers to kind of objective reality that's not up to us. That's the way I think of it. Stuff that's beyond our control to do anything about. So you just take what's given. The given is a good way of putting it. Naturally given or objectively given, or something that you can't really control. And so, yeah, that's a really nice interpretation. The butcher works with what he's given. He doesn't wish it were otherwise or waste a lot of time regretting how things are.
Yeah, and I guess it follows with the contrast between cooking himself and other butchers, good butchers and bad average butchers, right? Because that's the consequences.
Yeah.
If you don't attend to the shape of oxen, that's what happens.
The reality.
You break your knife.
Yeah. You get hurt, you get injured. And that's such a nice connection to, if you're always bumping up against the world and you're always going against the grain and you're not moving through life in this kind of spiritual way, in the sense of spiritual, life is hard and you become injured or more likely to be injured along the way. So it seems like a very nice metaphor here, actually. And I guess that was the point. This difference between looking with the eye and looking with the spirit or encountering something with spirit, I think there's something really interesting there. And I mean, maybe the idea is it's not so much as, of course, you still have to look with your material eye, but if the only thing that's going on is you're just seeing this physical three-dimensional object, you're not quite seeing all of reality. Maybe something like that's going on. So like Iris Murdoch has that idea of, in order to grow in virtue and love, you got to learn to really see someone. And she talks about really seeing. So there's this idea that, you see people on the street, you see that they're a material object, a physical being. But then if you actually care about someone, or if you recognize their worth or value or dignity, you see them differently. There's a sense of seeing with the spirit there. So I was wondering if Zhuangzi is identifying this way in which there's like just kind of ordinary seeing with your eyes, and then there's also this seeing with spirit, with the way that we see from the perspective of a moral agent from within, seeing someone's value or worth. That's something that happens with the spirit. I was wondering if something like that is going on here. It's not, of course, about the dignity or worth of humans, but there is that distinction, though. Like when you're really seeing the world with your spirit, you are seeing it in a different mode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, my temptation is to read it as suggesting that it's contrasting two models. Actually, some of the stuff Karyn has written on knowledge and mastery and skill before, I think is pretty consistent with the interpretation I'm about to give. So they're kind of two models. One is the sensible knowledge precedes decisions and actions, motivations kind of model. So first, step one, you see it, you look at it, you figure out where to enter, where your blade should enter, what you should do next, so on and so forth. And then step two, you proceed. But then the other model is one where some sort of motivation is already integrated. So where you're not stepping back to sort of assess what chunk of meat you have in front of you and how to cut it up. Instead, you're like already kind of motivated or moved to cut it up in some way. And I mean, maybe it's cheating a little bit to say you don't use your eyes at all, but still, for the most part, you don't spend a lot of time kind of passively assessing what it's like. Instead, you're kind of trying things out and poking and prodding. And so, in other words, motivation is integrated into the seeing. The reason I like that reading is because of the second of these two lines, sensible knowledge stops and spiritual desires proceed. So it seems like the fact that one encounters them with spirit, one encounters them with spiritual desires seems really important. Desires are in some ways motivating the encounter with the meat, with the carcass. Yeah. So I feel like we should move on to section 3, which is one that quite interests me. The section 3 is about how the butcher handles difficult parts or hard parts of his job. And the reason I'm interested in it is because there is a very standard reading of the Zhuangzi, according to which this is a classical kind of paradigmatic description of non-action, wu wei, this Chinese term that's often translated as non-action. And one of the typical ways of understanding wu wei or non-action is as effortless action. So people tend to think of things like sports, great athletes when they're in the zone, or really skillful people performing skillful activities at a high level. And it often seems effortless for them. And that's one of the reasons why it's tempting to read this as a passage that illustrates a kind of ideal action as effortless action. But very notably, the passage acknowledges that there are times where effort is required. I think there's no other way to read this passage except as the butcher acknowledging that sometimes it's hard, that his task is hard. He still minimizes the difficulty. So like, unlike other people where they probably chip their blades and find it really stressful and breaking sweat and everything, he's not struggling that much. But he still has to apply some effort, I think. That's the way I read this section. So I'll read it for you. It's a very short one. Section 3, still, when I get to a hard place, I see the difficulty and take breathless care. So you see, he acknowledges that it's difficult. He sees it as difficult. And presumably he's like taking breathless care. That's a good description, right? We all know that. Like when you are concentrating so hard, you realize you're not actually breathing fully, that you're taking really shallow breaths. All right, so he continues. My gaze settles, my movements slow. I move the chopper slightly, and in a twinkling, it's come apart, crumbling to the ground like a clod of earth. So it seems like he's enlisting gravity to help him finish the task. And he adds, I stand holding my chopper and glance all around, dwelling on my accomplishment. Then I clean my chopper and put it away. All right, so that's the butcher handling a difficult part. Yeah, what do you think?
I think it's a great part of the whole story, actually. And yeah, so there's this acknowledgement that, not everything is easy. And he's aware, but he knows also when he's coming to that place. And that's part of the wisdom, right? And so that's why I think, because this is supposed to be a kind of metaphor for living well, for flourishing. And and it also captures well human life. There are parts of life, of everyone's life, that's quite difficult. And sometimes it requires, focus, concentration, maybe also perseverance, various virtues. And even here, even though he's absolute master at this, there are still parts where he has to slow his movement and he has to take real care to make sure he does it right. And I think this is a fantastic part of the story.
Yeah, it humanizes him. I mean, this is why I often indulge my temptation to read the Zhuangzi as telling stories that are meant to be achievable, not supernatural, This is still someone who, despite his tremendous facility with butchery, encounters difficult spots now and then. He's able to minimize the difficulty more than the mere mortal, far more than I could, but it's still difficult for him. And depending on how you read the passage, maybe he even takes a little bit of pride in his accomplishment. I stand holding my chopper and glance all around, dwelling on my accomplishment. There are other ways of reading that line, by the way. It could just be like, he looks in the 4 directions is what it says. And so maybe he's just sort of taking in all that's been achieved, whether he sees it as his own accomplishment or not, maybe isn't so important.
There's so much going on there about attention, and the butcher knows he needs to slow down. So this is one of the themes that links to the earlier section where he says, what I value is the way which goes beyond technique. So if you just focus on technique, you'd be asking yourself, what do I do next? And you'd follow your standard techniques that you typically have. But because he goes along with the Tao, what he does is he knows he has to slow down. So this is quite interesting. I find it fascinating because people talk about these skill stories in the Zhuangzi. It's not really about knowing that. They say it's more about knowing how. And in some ways, I say yes and no, because yes, of course, they're skillful in the way that they compel readers to look at the performance, and these performances are so amazing, they're so extraordinary. And yet, on the other hand, what's happening in these passages, these people with lowly occupations, such as the butcher, they talk so eloquently about what they do. So it's not just that he does what he does as a butcher, but he's also able to tell you what he does as a butcher. So he tells you, he's self-aware. Yeah. It's after the activity, of course, but he says what he needs to do. So he's telling you, when you come to knotty situations, slow down. And by the way, he says, this is what I do. This is not unlike in another skill story, the wheelmaker. The wheelmaker who so daringly goes to the Duke and says, what are you doing? And the Duke says, I'm reading these books of the ways of sages. And then the wheelmaker is so insolent and so daring, by the way. He says, are they dead? And the Duke says, yes, they are. And he says, then you must be reading the dregs of dead old men. Then the Duke says, well, you better explain this or it's off with your head.
Yeah.
And the wheelmaker says, well, I speak it from my point of view. So they're telling us stories about what they do. And we won't rehearse the whole wheelmaker story here. But basically, he goes on precisely to tell the Duke what it is that he does. And they're often so eloquent. They describe what they do. So there's a level of knowingness in these, masters. So there's knowing that, there's knowing how, there's more. There's much more again, right? And there's a lot of attentiveness. Again, going to a different story, the cicada catcher story, which we're talking about. The cicada catcher says, I focus only on cicada wings. I don't let anything distract me. And I suppose one general theme that arises from these stories about attention is that when it comes to knotty situations, you need to know what it is you have to attend to. Well, you have to observe the heavenly patterns. I can't tell you. You have to look at the heavenly patterns. You have to engage with them responsively. And therefore, you slow down. You slow down because you need to look. It's so fascinating.
Yeah, it's situation specific. The solutions are going to be so situation specific that a good teacher is not going to even pretend to be able to answer the question in advance, right?
Right.
That's quite interesting. I wanted to fill the listeners in on something here. Karyn used this phrase, knowing that, knowing how. So these are two different kinds. Sometimes people say kinds of knowledge. I notice that professional epistemologists often say two different kinds of knowledge ascriptions. And the idea is roughly this. I'm going to give you a kind of crude characterization of it, but you can say something like, I know that a single cell organism is made up of these component parts. That's one kind of knowledge ascription. I know that it's, here are the organelles of this single cellular organism. And then there's something else entirely, which is like, I know how to ride a bike, or I know how to play a piano. I know how to lead people, or something like that. And the question is, in what does that knowledge consist? Like, in virtue of what do you say that person really has the knowledge? And it seems like they're two totally different things. In the case of knowledge that single cell organisms have a certain structure, it's like essentially that you have, good reason to believe, or you have warranted belief in certain sentences being true, certain propositions being true. And whereas in the case of knowledge how, like it's often spelled out in terms of being able to actually perform the activity. So we think that someone counts as being able to, as knowing how to play piano, if they can actually play piano, even if they can't articulate what it is that makes the piano playing good or successful or what have you. And so oftentimes it's said in conjunction with the Zhuangzi that it's all about knowing how and not about knowledge that. And one thing that Karyn does really well in her scholarship on Zhuangzi and skill stories in Daoist literature is points out how, in fact, it seems like something a little bit more of a hybrid and more complex is going on here, because what part of the mastery that we see in these characters, like the wheelwright, the wheelmaker, or cook ding, or the butcher, is that they also have some knowledge that they're also able to describe and articulate certain relevant facts. For example, he knows that it's a difficult problem that he's about to face, and thus that he should slow down. So it might be a little too simple to say that it's all knowledge how and not no knowledge that whatsoever. It seems like it's a complex hybrid of the two kinds of knowledge.
Right.
Yeah, and it seems like having some knowledge that, some, I guess the other way epistemologists describe it is propositional knowledge or knowledge. Yeah, I've seen some arguments say that one reason why you need to have some theoretical knowledge like that, let's say even for a virtuous person, is because sometimes there'll be novel situations or situations that come up that you haven't quite faced before. And in order to know how to deal with that, there has to be a bit more of a robust form of theoretical knowledge to be able to act well in a novel situation. So yeah, that seems right to me, what Karyn was saying there, that there's more of a hybrid there. That seems right.
Yeah. You at least have to know whether you're facing a typical situation or an atypical one. And if it's an atypical one, then you know, okay, it's time to slow down and examine and think this through. Yeah. Okay, so that's section 3, and then section 4, I'll read. It's the very short one. I call it the ruler's takeaway. Lord Wenhui said, "Excellent. I have heard the words of a butcher and learned how to care for life." So I'm a scholar primarily of later Chinese philosophy, post-classical philosophy. The phrase caring for life, yang sheng in Chinese, I'm going to just give you an interpretation of it that comes entirely through my post-classical thinkers. But later in the history of Chinese philosophy, basically, if you talked about doing something that was in the service of life, sheng, that was your way of signaling that you were concerned with what I'm going to call common sense, this worldly goods. So over and against those crazy Buddhists, and I don't actually believe that the Buddhists are crazy, but this is from the point of view of the later Neo-Confucians who were critics of Buddhists. They thought, well, those Buddhists seem to be aspiring for some sort of transcendent good that goes beyond life and death, samsara, the cycle of life and death. They'd say, we Confucians believe in life understood as goods that have to do with self-preservation, just living to a ripe old age, growing up, developing, reproducing, having children and grandchildren. And so when I see yang sheng, I take this phrase that's caring for life. I think, the ruler has said, I've learned this really interesting skill story, but actually the conclusions that I'm taking away from it have to do with more basic, uncontroversial goods that everyone can get behind. Like I can learn how to live to an old age, relatively content, and develop as a person and have children and so on, basically by extrapolating from, or maybe analogizing to, I'm not sure, this skill story that the butcher has just told me. So that's my very biased reading, influenced by later Chinese philosophy. Is it crazy?
Well, I thought some people argue that Zhuangzi was influenced by Yangju or Yangism,
Yes.
which seems to emphasize this kind of ordinary concern for oneself, and some people say it's some kind of egoism. I'm not sure. I know that there's a lot of controversies about the actual views of Yangju and the text, and I mean, we don't really even have the writings, right? So, but at least that's true though, as a historical account or part of the real narrative that unfolded. Yeah, that seems like there's some plausibility there. But I guess the real puzzle here is, what did Lord Wenhui learn? Like, what is the caring for life in this context? Like, I don't. It's a little bit tricky to figure out what exactly he learned. After this.
Yeah, it's so enigmatic, right?
Yes.
Because what could you learn from life just looking at and listening to a butcher, like a mere butcher? And the standard view, of course, is that you work within constraints. How does the butcher work within constraints? Well, he talks about how he has never needed to sharpen his knife because he carves through the joints. Actually, he carves, the knife moves in the spaces between the joints. And incidentally, just a side remark here, it's fascinating when you read the skill stories across the Zhuangzi. Whoever has written these stories must have closely observed these people in action, or at least talk to them in great detail, because you get such insights into what it is to look for. And if you've ever even tried to carve the Thanksgiving turkey, for instance, so you can carve at a point between the joints where the knife just slides through. If not, it's hellish and you could break the knife, exactly as what's being said here.
Yeah.
And there's also a story about the swimmer who seems crazy. Confucius, who watches him, thinks he's committing suicide or something. And this swimmer just jumps into the dangerous cascades at the bottom of very vigorous and high waterfall.
Yeah.
And swimmer says, look, I go along with the water. I don't have a Tao because the water has a Tao. And I follow the water's Tao, he says. And so whoever has written these stories know where exactly those difficult points are. It's just fascinating. They must have spoken to these people in action, right? And they must tell me what's difficult about their job. What are the challenges you find? Almost as if that might have happened.
I just want to chime in there and say, I think all of them that you've mentioned have come from chapter 19, the Dasheng chapter. It's sometimes translated as penetrating life, or there are lots of ways of translating it. And what's interesting about them is that, Confucius is the interlocutor in each case. So it's like, not in the Cook Ding passage, Confucius doesn't appear there, but in chapter 19 and all those skill stories, it's always Confucius that encounters these really skillful people who are essentially artisan class people, or even just like laborers, people who move ferries back and forth or go swimming to catch fish and what have you. And he's wowed by them. So you get the impression that the authors were, it's hard to know for sure, but one speculates that they were just deeply impressed with this idea that for the Confucians, they thought there was something Confucianism could teach people. And so here they were going around positioning themselves as teachers and saying, listen to this lesson, listen to this lesson. And the authors of the Zhuangzi must have thought, well, no, that's the wrong way of going about it. You have to actually go talk to the people who practice this stuff all the time and learn as they do, right? Yeah, you just get the impression that they were kind of deeply impressed by something about that kind of mastery or knowledge that they were seeing in people who are just laborers or artisans.
Thank you, Justin. And then back to this passage about what's being learned. The typical understanding is that what Lord Wenhui learns from the butcher is a message that works well for political life, that you have to juggle so many things. You work with your advisors, and it's also a consideration for the advisors. You work with these powerful people who have the capacity to just chop off your heads as they wish. And life is precarious. Even if life is precarious, though, you can slow down and find your space between the joints, so to speak. And then in that regard, one way of understanding Yangism that talks about the preservation of life is to see it in part as a political message, that to say, well, there are lots of dangers lurking in corners as an official. And that in a way makes sense, because a lot of these texts that have come down to us from the Warring States period, texts that were written by people who are involved in official life, people who are involved in public life. You wouldn't have a text written by an ordinary person who's tilling the fields. So these are their concerns. They're worried about the dangers that are lurking in corners, people who will stab them, behind their backs and things like that in the back. This could be a reading of what's going on, but I have I'm going to throw a spanner in the works here. And this only occurred to me in the last little while, that maybe the standard reading is wrong. So going back to this section again, Lord Wenhui said, excellent. I have heard the words of a butcher and learned how to care for life. I was wondering if maybe this is spoofing Lord Wenhui.
Oh.
Maybe we shouldn't take the conclusion to this passage at face value. Maybe the butcher has performed, because we know that Lord Wenhui has seen him do it, and the butcher talks about what he does. And for the butcher, this is his way, this is his Dao. It's the butcher's entire life. In this brief exchange where Lord Wenhui has heard the butcher's words, is it even possible that by hearing these words, you can say, oh, yeah, yep, got it, I got it.
Yeah.
So I think it could be a spoof. And this could be a spoof in light of a passage that takes place just before this story, which I think this story is trying to illustrate and respond to, actually.
Yeah. Should I read a few lines from that passage?
Yes, thanks, Justin.
This Cookting passage, the butcher passage, appears in chapter 3 of the Zhuangzi. It's not the opening passage. There's a prior passage that opens it, and it's kind of it's a well-known one. And I'm just going to read the first 3 lines because it makes reference to life and knowledge, which seem to be relevant here now that we're talking about learning how to care for life. So here is the memorable opening to chapter 3. Life is bounded, knowledge is unbounded. Using the bounded to follow the unbounded is dangerous. And if you take that as knowledge, that's really dangerous. All right. So life is bounded, knowledge is unbounded. Using the bounded, which suggests life, to follow the unbounded, knowledge is dangerous. And if you take that, using the bounded as unbounded as knowledge, that's really dangerous. Okay, so you see a connection between this learning how to care for life and those opening lines.
Yeah, so I think just relying on this short interchange and focusing on words, only the words, and to think, yeah, I know now how to go about life. So this is a very unusual reading. I haven't heard it before. It's just a thought that occurred to me. And I have to say, I need to think about it more.
Yeah.
Whether this is a spoof of what Lord Wenhui is doing, right? Like as if you could talk about caring for life in this way, just by words, without doing it.
Yeah. No, I've never heard that interpretation.
Yeah.
Never thought of it. You know, have you watched this movie Ikiru? It's this famous movie, Japanese movie. Oh, you got to watch it. It's 1954. I show it to my students in Intro to Philosophy. It has to do with meaning of life. I'm going to spoil it. Ikiru, this man, he's an office worker, leads this incredibly boring life. He's just, you know, counting the minutes away, and he hates it. He's a bureaucrat in Japanese society, but he learns that he's going to die in about 6 months. So anyways, it is inspiring. He builds this beautiful playground for children, and then he passes away. But there's this final scene where all the people are like, I guess after the funeral, where they're like drinking together and talking about him.
Yeah,
and
sort of
all the other the office workers are there, and they're drinking, and they get quite drunk. And then there's a moment where they all like say, "I'm gonna change my life today. Like I'm gonna like live like Ikiru, and starting tomorrow." And then the movie ends with the last scene the next day, where you just see them doing the same thing. They're just at the bureaucratic office with the stacks of papers. And that's how it's kind of sad, actually, in a way. But yeah, but they have that moment where like,
yeah.
And then it's back to usual. It reminded me of that part because it's, how can you really change like that instantaneously? It's like, I think that's one of the problems with sometimes the, motivational stuff, where people are like very inspired by some story and I'm going to change my life. But it takes a long time and a lot of effort and real practice and dedication to really like do something substantial like that and change the course of your life. You might feel very strong in the moment, but how can you do that? Yeah, so that's why it kind of made sense to me what you're saying there, Karyn, although I've never quite thought of that passage like that.
It's just a stab in the dark, just a wandering thought.
Right.
With Zhuangzi, it's possible, right?
I know, that's the thing. Yeah, it is the Zhuangzi.
So sometimes in the Zhuangzi, it's invoking what's understood to be a kind of a template for the genre. Like there's a standard formula in these dialogues where a ruler will be doing something and some lowly person will say something or do something and the ruler will pass judgment on it. The point is that after the ruler has heard the lower status person speak, they become more enlightened. So like the formulaic version of the story is definitely the one where he now understands something really deep and profound, Lord Wenhui. But Zhuangzi sometimes undermines the standard formulae. And so it wouldn't be surprising if, in fact, we're supposed to kind of laugh at the ruler for thinking that he's actually learned something about caring for life here. Yeah.
Yeah. And then just respond to what Richard was saying. We really need to ask, as a reader of the Zhuangzi, what you do with all these skill stories. In some ways, we can read them as challenges to the elevated lives of the court officials and the important people. So they're presenting ways in which ordinary people doing ordinary things, and I say ordinary in scare quotes, ordinary as perceived by people of rank, we do things well and we do things beautifully. The performance is awesome. And even all these important people, including Confucius, come look at us and they're completely awestruck. But what do we do with so many models? Which one do we follow? Do we all start, becoming butchers and cicada catchers and swimmers? And what I feel about these different models is Zhuangzi is not saying to us, go and be like them, as Richard narrated in this movie. But rather it's more about us reading and thinking, that's interesting. That's one way to do life, so to speak. And that's another way to do life. And so in some ways, whatever we choose, going back to the opening of chapter 3 that Justin read us, life is bounded, knowledge is unbounded. Always to recognize that the life we have is bounded because there are heavenly patterns that we need to respond to. We can't just ride roughshod over them. Sometimes it's dangerous, sometimes it's not dangerous, but we still need to heed them. And life is bounded, so we can't all become butchers. And the Zhuangzi is not saying to us we all become cicada catchers or wheel makers either, but to see how people can live well, doing what they do.
Yeah, it's really interesting concluding thought on the part of Lord Wenhui. I've learned how to care for life or nurture life. It's tempting to read it as kind of an analogy. I guess that's basically how you read it, Karyn. Is that right? Like we've learned about how one deals with the natural patterns, the things that are sort of fixed and beyond our control. I guess I'm just wondering if that's what it is. It's just like a metaphor for caring for life, or is there something more to it?
Right. The way can be found in all kinds of places and in all kinds of different activities. And so, I guess that's Karyn's really.
And you need to do it yourself. You need to live life yourself. And it's not transferable. That's where I think the sticking point is, if you want to take the thought I had about
right. So your point is Lord Wenhui, really what he needs to do is he needs to do the living, and he needs to find the natural patterns to fit himself into. And that's when you have, really know or have learned how to care for life.
So not maybe through words, right?
Right. Not just by hearing this. No, although maybe that's the first little initial stepping stone, but part of the path. But that's not really the living.
Yeah, the reading according to which it's a spoof on Lord Wenhui is that he naively thinks it's a metaphor for how to care for life. When in fact, it's just something like, I want to say, a demonstration of how someone who really knows how to care for life does it, that he should then kind of seek to emulate in his entirely distinctive way, in his entirely distinctive context. Don't read too much into it, but just approach it with the same open-mindedness or something.
Right. Because the tasks that Lord Wenhui, would take on are completely different from what the butcher does. So he needs to work out what his heavenly patterns are in his occupation.
But the reason why I suppose I didn't take it in the spoofy way was because I thought that there are these specific kind of broad principles or broad points that I can kind of see wisdom in. So, for example, trying to find this way of not like really rubbing up against life or people. For example, like in the 3 a.m. passage in the Zhuangzi, right?
Yeah.
The monkey trainer finds a good, clever way, a creative way of harmonizing with the monkeys. And so he's not just like screaming at them and they get more angry. So in the same way, like
Yeah.
when we give kids medicine, we put a little bit of sugar, right? Like the
Yeah.
song goes, a
Yeah.
spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down because, well, the sugar is not good for you, but the medicine is. And so you put a little bit of sugar
Yeah.
so that they're able to take the medicine into their body and absorb it. And so I found that in life, like confronting, directly sometimes is not the right path. It's not the best path. And I
Yeah.
think that's kind of a theme in the Zhuangzi. Like you got to kind of sometimes
Yes.
step outside a little bit and find the less coercive path, the path where you're not having to exert so much of your will and pressure. That often is a good way to go about life and not prevent injury or harm.
Yeah. So that lends itself to the sincere reading, the non-spoofy reading, right?
Yeah. But the spoofy reading also agrees that there's plenty to learn from Kukding, though.
Right.
And the main difference, I suppose, is to say that it's not transferable.
Okay.
In the way Lord Wenhui thinks it is.
Yeah, in that way. Yeah, maybe there's some broad ideas, but not like.
Yeah.
So it sort of depends on the level of description. So like if you take it at a relatively low level of description, describing how you encounter tough problems in life or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. So things like moving the knife between the joints. And it's interesting to see that Kukding slows down. So what are the joints that we have to navigate, for instance?
Yeah, that's great. This has been wonderful. I tend to think that we have a successful discussion if this is a very biased way of understanding how a podcast should work. But if in the space of our hour to hour and a half of talking, I feel like I've learned lots of new things that weren't just sort of pre-orchestrated or planned or what have you, that we actually did spontaneously reach some new insights, then for me, it's really successful. And so by that measure, I think it was a very great discussion. Many thanks, Karyn and Richard, for facilitating this. We have this custom that we're trying to establish, according to which when we have a guest on, first of all, we just as a courtesy and as a way of acquainting our listeners with a broader range of scholars, we just mention, works that they've written and done. And we've already mentioned recently that Karyn is hard at work with Peter Adamson on the China version of History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, which is terrific. I've already listened to the first 2 episodes and really admire it. And so that's something we can recommend to people. And we'll put a link in our show notes, of course, and encourage listeners to listen to that one. And then the other thing we do customarily is we ask a couple of questions of our guests. And the first one is the simplest one to ask. But given that you read all these influential Chinese texts, if there were one that you could recommend to people above all others, like what is the one text that you would say, this is a must read if you can only take one text with you to the next life or to a desert island or something. And sometimes we've been tempted to add other than Zhuangzi because it seems like almost everyone wants to study Zhuangzi. Anyway, you can give us the answer to that question if you want, or you can give us the answer to the much simpler question, which doesn't make any special exceptions for Zhuangzi.
No, it has to be the Zhuangzi.
Yeah.
And if you think most people would be inclined to say the Zhuangzi, then that speaks for itself.
Yeah.
It's just such a fascinating text. Amongst other things, authors seem to be so self-aware. And you have to ask what a text is doing during a time when this is the discourse that goes on between important people involved in official life, involved in government. What is a text doing using animals, for instance, that sometimes speak? What would these kind of snooty officials have thought about that? And we know also that the Zhuangzi, some of its stories have come through in the Chinese tradition as children's stories, such as the famous The Frog in the Well, who knew only the kind of life he led and he thought it was fantastic. That's a children's story, picture book, published many times over. And so it's wonderful. It speaks to all audiences, but really the self-knowingness of the authors is just amazing.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the reasons it's tempting to recommend it again and again, because it's not just a text that you would read when in a certain mood or to solve a particular philosophical problem or something. It has this broader application. So at various stages of life.
Just very quickly on that too, for listeners who don't know the Zhuangzi well, there is a chapter 5 in the Zhuangzi that it has people figuring in there who are simply people we would consider or classify disabled. And I have in my work talked about the Zhuangzi using these so-called, and I use this in scare quote, deformities. And the Zhuangzi uses kind of grotesque words like, someone with a picture-sized neck, a bulbous neck. And I think deliberately to point out to those important people that, well, this is how you see them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's yet another way in which the text is very surprising. Yeah, so chapter 5 is in some ways one that we should think about discussing in greater detail at some point, Richard. I can think of some scholars who would have a lot to say about that particular theme, the one that Karyn mentions, people with disabilities or in other ways seen as having sort of biological restrictions that in fact they manage to transcend in some spiritual or psychological sense. It's a very controversial de Chongfu. It's hard to say, but two standard translations are, so fu, I often translate as signs, but of abundant virtue or complete virtue. All right, so then we have a second traditional question.
Yeah. Okay. So usually the second question is something like, in your study of Chinese philosophy broadly, is there a certain idea that you think would be practically useful for people, that would help people lead better lives? So it's a kind of practical question.
Yeah, I think the Chinese texts in general have a fascinating kind of, I almost think of it as a one thread. And I say because I think there are other threads. It's a thread that goes through a lot of Chinese philosophy, and that's about the malleability of humanity. Malleability meaning the way we can hone our capacities to do better. And it's not just about how you can hone intelligence or mental acuity, but also getting in a lot of Warring States texts, the idea that you hone your bodily and your intellectual capacities together. We certainly get that across the skill stories in the Zhuangzi. And like I said, it's not just in the Zhuangzi, you see that in Confucianism too. Confucian focus on ritual. There's something really interestingly physiological about us as humans. And I think that incidentally often drops out of the picture a little bit in Anglophone philosophical discussions. The integration of the body and the intellect and the emotions, of course.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, so there are kind of two things there which tend to be somewhat neglected in, we might say, the kind of counterpart literature that we find in the West. One is that self-cultivation is a lifelong endeavor. Like there's this conviction, even people like Zhuangzi who think that human nature is bad, unlike, you might say, the counterparts to Zhuangzi in the West who think we have this original sin that we'll never get rid of or something. He actually thinks we can still become sages and completely transform our psychology. So there's this conviction that we have this we're very malleable beings, and we can always work to make ourselves better in various ways. And then, as you say, yes, there's one of the reasons I love to read Chinese texts is because I think that they're more aware or attuned to the various ways in which ordinary is integrated with various kinds of less intellectual processes that we might call embodied ones or automatic ones, or unselfconscious, not entirely explicit cognition, all those emotions and so on. They're really attuned to that, and it's one of the remarkable features. So you're right, it's something that we can take away from Chinese philosophy, not just from Taoism or not just from the Zhuangzi, but from Chinese philosophy more broadly. Okay, well, this has been great. Many thanks to Karyn. We appreciated really having this discussion with you, Karyn. We're glad that you gave us some of your time on this particular passage. We thought you'd be just the right person to discuss this passage with. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. The pleasure's mine.
Thank you very much, Karyn.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I suppose that was the way for today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Bye, everyone.